Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today for our Workers' Rights on the Ballot webinar. It's about 12 noon right now. We're going to hang on for just a couple more minutes and let folks who are late arriving come in, and we'll be starting in about 5 minutes or so. Thanks a lot. All right. Hi, everyone. Hi there. I'm Ian Eve Perry. I'm the policy manager here at TechEquity Collaborative. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this important conversation about workers' rights on the ballot. Just a quick note, my colleague Herman Calderon is in the chat and can answer any technical questions you may have. And if you have questions for the panelists, please drop them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them at the end. Before we get started, I just want to tell you all who are new to TechEquity a little bit about who we are and what we do. We're an organization based here in the Bay Area that's mobilizing tech workers and tech companies around issues that we think will make it such that as the tech economy grows, everyone benefits from that growth. We do this in 3 ways. We educate tech workers and companies with events like this that help people who work in the tech industry understand the issues that we work on. We also do issue advocacy. So we have a policy agenda that we advocate for at the state and local level with the help of our tech workers and tech companies. We also connect tech workers with their neighbors and the communities where they live to help them build a deeper sense of empathy and connection to our neighborhoods and neighbors. Today is our last webinar in our series of statewide ballot measure webinars, but we have 3 more coming over the next few weeks that will cover the local ballots around the Bay Area, just so you know. And our work at TechEquity focuses on 2 main issues, housing and workforce and labor. We've identified these 2 as really critical areas that we need to address if we're going to see a growing tech economy that creates opportunity for everyone. Today, we're going to be focusing on a ballot measure that touches on that second issue area, workforce and labor. So that one ballot measure that we have to discuss today is only one, which is fewer than some of the ones our earlier webinars, but this one's a doozy. And it's probably the only one that's been spamming your phone with notifications over the last few weeks. So this one is Prop 22, which is written and paid for by Uber, Lyft, Doordash, Instacart, and Postmates, which I should disclose is a corporate partner of TechEquity. The measure would carve out those companies' drivers from recent laws that crack down on the practice of misclassifying workers as independent contractors instead of employees. That recent law, AB 5, codified a recent California Supreme Court decision that laid out a simple test to determine if a worker is an employee or an independent contractor. Basically, the law says that you're an employee unless you're free from the control of the hiring entity while you're doing your work. You're doing work that is outside of the hiring entity's primary type of business, and you yourself have your own business. So drivers for these app-based companies are almost certainly employees under that test. And this is a position that's been echoed by California's Attorney General and some recent court decisions. So enter Prop 22, which is an attempt to use the initiative process as a last-ditch effort to legally call drivers independent contractors, now that the law has changed to make it very clear that they should be considered employees. The measure would set some pay standards and provide some benefits to drivers, but those would be at levels that are below what the drivers would get if they were classified as employees. Drivers would be paid at least 120% of the minimum wage, reimbursed for some of their expenses, and some drivers who work enough hours would get a stipend to help pay for health insurance. There is, however, quite a catch on all 3 of these. Not all of the time that most of us would consider work is counted as working time for those pay and benefits. The measure defines this concept called engaged time to measure what goes in for those things. And it defines engaged time as the time between when a driver accepts an assignment and drops off the passenger delivery. The time in between assignments, however, doesn't count towards engaged time, which means they're not paid, they're not reimbursed, and that time doesn't count towards qualifying for the health insurance stipend. This is an issue, though, because that time in between assignments accounts for about 1/3 of drivers' working time. So all in all, the UC Berkeley Labor Center, which again, full disclosure, I used to work for, calculated that this pay guarantee would be worth as little as $5.64 an hour, which is well below the state's minimum wage. Drivers, if they end up as independent contractors, would also lose out on other benefits like paid time off, overtime, unemployment insurance, and full workers' compensation insurance, which kicks in if they're injured on the job, say in like a traffic accident. Crucially, they would also not be able to form a union and join together with their collective voices to work to improve their jobs. Now, to be fair, there's a contingent of drivers who support Prop 22 and oppose AB 5. because they fear that becoming employees would reduce the flexibility that those driving jobs currently provide. It's not really clear how much flexibility would change if they're classified as employees, but it does seem likely that there would be somewhat more structure applied to drivers' work hours and scheduling. So taking all of this into consideration, we here at TechEquity are opposed to Prop 22, and we recommend that you vote no on the measure. We think that Prop 22 takes away too many rights and codifies a sub-minimum wage pay standard for drivers. And just that any flexibility that's made possible by independent contractor status is just not worth these losses. We're concerned that the measure sets a ridiculously high 7/8 majority standard for the legislature to modify the measure. And it also prevents local governments from more aggressively regulating the companies, which we feel is just too onerous a set of restrictions. It's also important for us to consider some of the sordid history of these companies and their compliance with the law. For too long, they've ignored legal restrictions and regulations and kind of banked on their size to overwhelm efforts to set limits on their control. It seems now that some of their chickens have come home to roost with AB5 and some of the recent kind of backlash to their practices. And we feel that it sets a really bad precedent to allow the companies to use their financial might to spend upwards, like in the ballpark of $200 million to buy their way out of this latest legal jam. That being said, we really want to be clear here at TechEquity that we're not opposed to technological innovations that change the way that people work. But it's crucial that those innovations must serve both workers and the companies. A truly equitable tech-driven economy must provide long-term prosperity to its workers. That's really a bottom line that we can't go without. So while we see the appeal of being able to pick up some extra work on short notice to help bring in some extra money for one's family, we must remember that historically changes that added flexibility to the labor markets have in the long run tended to undermine workers and cause them to lose out overall. That's why we're opposing Prop 22, but we still remain open to alternatives that utilize new technology in a way that not only provides benefits to the companies and consumers, but make sure that workers get their fair share of those benefits as well. So now that I've kind of told you a little bit about Prop 22 and our position on it, we're going to move into the panel part of today's discussion, where we have a couple of panelists who can provide both a driver's eye kind of perspective on Prop 22 and some of these issues. And then we also have a researcher who's looked at some of the broader questions about independent contracting and its effect on the economy. So today we have Nicole Moore, who's a driver and organizer with Rideshare Drivers United. And we have Chris Benner, who's the director at the UC Santa Cruz Institute for Social Transformation. I also want to point out that we hope to include a driver who supports Proposition 22 so that we could round out today's panel and balance some of our discussion of the measure. But unfortunately, the Yes on 22 campaign declined to connect us with a driver who's affiliated with their campaign. So saying all of that, let's kick off the panel part. And we're going to begin our discussion with Nicole. And then later on, we'll start talking to Chris about some of these kind of broader questions about contracting.
Great.
So hi, Nicole.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well. So I guess why don't we just kind of start off with you telling us a little bit about some of your background driving for the companies and why you got started doing that.
Sure. I'm a part-time driver. I've been driving for Lyft and a couple other app-based companies for 3 years. I started 3 years ago because our housing costs doubled and we were looking at maybe losing our home. And we cut down all our expenses that we could, and we still were significantly short, and the only option was to bring in more money. So in that way, I'm probably like a lot of the people you see in the Yes commercials. I'm a part-time driver, and I do this for extra money to pay what I need to live. What I got, I got involved in organizing with other drivers because within a couple months of starting to drive for Lyft, I had originally been guaranteed 80% of the fare. And shortly into my time driving, my pay was slipping to 50%, sometimes even 40%. And I've seen the lowest one I ever had was 20% of what the passengers were paying. And so I was finding myself able to earn what I needed to earn in a night, and it was turning into 2 nights, and they were really long nights. And there was just no way to sustain it. So, and there was, it didn't matter that when I started, I was guaranteed 80%. They had changed the terms of service, and this was the new rate. So that's why I got involved with other drivers who had started to organize in Los Angeles.
Totally. And I really appreciate the way that you link kind of some of these issues about labor and housing costs, which, we recognize here is the high cost of housing in California does kind of drive people into some of these tricky situations in the labor market. And, these two issues really are kind of inextricably linked like that.
And we were targeted with one of those bad loans. So we're totally, that's where we are. That's our situation, so.
I guess the other kind of big issue that all of us can't stop thinking about right now, and we're all doing this webinar from our homes, is the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that has affected drivers' jobs.
Well, I mean, the first thing is that the minute COVID became a thing in California, the rides dried up. I mean, people were sitting in their cars for 2 days getting a ride, and we were not making an income. So that was the first thing. I think the second thing was realizing that this is actually a deadly disease. And if we were gonna try to continue to earn in our cars, we were gonna be at great risk. Initially there was no information. People were getting into cars without masks on. Drivers were trying to wear them because we were trying to stay safe. And all of that, understand that's, we had to purchase ourselves. We had to look on the CDC site and see what the safety precautions were. What we saw in China was people were putting barriers between the front and back seats. None of that information was provided to us initially. And honestly, Lyft started their own PPE site where you could purchase PPE and barriers from the company to create a safer environment for you in your car. Most of us stopped driving. I think 20 to 30% of the drivers are left in the street driving because there's still not the demand that there used to be. And because some people have underlying health conditions and don't want to be on the road. We had the unfortunate situation of one of our colleagues who had to go back because she couldn't get the unemployment insurance that is actually guaranteed to her in California under the law. And she went back to work for 3 weeks, caught COVID, and was dead a week later. So there's no doubt that this is really, this really brought home to us how important employee rights are. First of all, AB 5 did pass, just as you said, but none of us saw the results of it because the companies basically just with impunity went forward, without changing any of their behavior. So when we went to get the unemployment insurance that we were due based on the fact that our jobs had just ended because of COVID, the companies don't turn over our wages, our wage information to the state. The companies don't pay into the bucket. So when you call unemployment office, they say you're not eligible. And so we did a big education campaign with our members and rideshare drivers in general, and just said, look, you are eligible for this. And this was before PUA was even available, right? But it literally took months for people to get their money. We see this, the risks that people are under without the protection of the law, right? We see safety issues. We see, being on the road for hours at a time and after expenses making way less than minimum wage. We see when people are ill, they work through it because otherwise they're not going to make their rent. All of these issues are just because the companies aren't following our laws. And Prop 22 is sort of them throwing down the gauntlet and saying, we actually don't want labor laws to apply to us. I think one of the really important things about Prop 22 is it doesn't apply to all workers. It just applies to app-based delivery and drivers. So it's really carving, some of the most precarious workers in California out of any kinds of protections. And we are not independent contractors. We do not have our own business. Uber and Lyft set the rates. We take them or we don't drive. That's it. And we don't have much control. The only thing we have control over, which is that issue of flexibility, is when we turn on the app and when we turn it off. That's what we have control over. What I will say is that drivers like myself need the flexibility, but there is nothing incompatible with employment law and flexibility. So when you see the numbers that you were talking about in terms of drivers wanting to remain independent, I would say that the companies have done a very good job in sort of misinforming us about what independent contracting means. When 100% of the drivers I know will say they value flexibility. If you ask them, do you need to be part-time? 80% of the drivers will say yes. Then when you say, do you think you can be part-time and an employee? People say no. People believe that if you're an employee, you can't be part-time and you can't have a flexible work schedule. That stuff is not incompatible with employment law. Remind everybody that, there's lots of part-time people who are employees who receive W-2s and then have the safety net that we need, right? There are so many, honestly, after 3 years of driving, my car is very high mileage, even as a part-time driver. Mm-hmm. I still have a couple years to pay off on the loan, and it's not really worth it, because basically what I've done by driving is I finance the fleet. I pay for the gas, the insurance. I pay for the maintenance. When your transmission goes out, you have to put 4 new tires on your car. All of that you pay for, and then your car is not worth anything, and you have financed the fleet for Lyft and Uber, who are billion-dollar companies who are paying you basically after expenses. I average $8 to $9 an hour, so you're basically cutting the a piece of your car off and putting it in your wallet every time you drive. And that's the situation we're in. There's no doubt that this has been an innovative approach to transit and has been helpful in covering a lot of the transit gaps in our system. And I enjoy driving. I know most drivers do. It's an interesting job, but there's no reason why these companies can't actually live under basic labor law. I have colleagues who have invested in cars and end up homeless because the rates go down. Most drivers, 4 or 5 years ago started at $1.75 per mile was how much they were paid. We're now earning 60 cents a mile. And in Las Vegas, they just changed the rates to 40 cents a mile. So when you think that IRS reimbursement rate for your car, which is, an estimate of what the average car costs to operate per mile, is 58 cents, and these companies are paying 60 cents to us only while we have a passenger in the car. So Prop 22, tries to pretend it's filling some kind of gap by offering 30 cents a mile reimbursement only when you have a passenger in the car or on your way to pick somebody up. So we've done the math. The math shows that we're still gonna be operating under minimum wage with Prop 22. So we say, why would we want anything but the basic labor protections, which, let's be honest here, labor protections in California are still a very low bar. $15 an hour will still make you housing precarious in most big cities in California.
Yeah.
But the safety net is something we need.
Yeah, that's actually something I wanted to just ask was kind of like what could you just tell us like what being classified as an employee would mean to you as a driver? Or, how does that change kind of your not only your experience working, but kind of just overall?
Well, I mean, we started our own organization called Rideshare Drivers United, and we're now 19,000 drivers across California. And we are, trying to, our goal is to have fair pay and to have a voice in this industry that we honestly have helped build. Many people were some of the early proponents of Lyft and Uber, passing out the cards at events and that sort of thing to really help build the brand. So there's no doubt that we're important to the industry, but we, the safety net, the first thing is just an honest pay for a fair hour's work is really important. Nobody wants to just make minimum wage, but absolutely a guaranteed hourly wage base is really essential so that you can count on something after you put in 8 to 12 hours in a day. So that you're not coming home. I've had days where I've come home netting $5 an hour. It's not worth it. It creates poverty in our communities. But the things such as unemployment insurance, granted under COVID, unemployment has been available to independent contractors as well. That's not usually true. That's a really important thing to close the gap if you are deactivated from driving or, have other reasons. Disability is really important.
Tell us a little bit more about that term deactivation and kind of what that means and how that works if people aren't familiar with that.
Sure. After earnings, the second most important issue for drivers in our group is deactivation. Many drivers will be deactivated, which means terminated, and sometimes it's temporary and sometimes it's not, for absolutely no reason that they can follow up in or defend themselves about when they get a bad rating or it's been really bad in COVID because when you ask a passenger to put on a mask who's not wearing one, they're supposed to be wearing them anyway, but they'll give you a bad rating. Those ratings can cause you to be deactivated. We have drivers who have dash cams in their cars in order to be able to defend themselves against, what's happening, that, nothing happened. They just wanted a free ride. That's, so people are losing their jobs and have no way to defend themselves. I bring up the dash cam because I have a colleague who had dash cam footage of the ride that allegedly deactivated him. And it showed that the driver did nothing and the company didn't even want to see it, right? So they deactivate people with no reason. Sometimes it's short-term, sometimes it's long-term. And so deactivation is something that's really hard on folks.
Yeah, so how would, I guess, employment status change that?
I mean, all of the, people talk about portable benefits and, that kind of thing and sort of these Band-Aids. Employment gives us this whole layer of benefits that are truly portable, right? So whether it's sick leave, family leave, workers' compensation, which is critical. Many drivers get in accidents and then can't work, and there's nothing to back them up. There's no way for them to get the health care they need. But I think one of the things that's really important to drivers is we've seen the companies go lower and lower and lower, and we have no voice in it. Regulation will help, and that's important. But drivers want the opportunity to organize their own unions if they want to, and that's what the 19,000 folks in our group want to do. Is they want to have a union where they have a contract and they can have a voice in what's happening. By taking people out of employment, the companies have, are basically writing their own labor law, and then they're not allowing any voice for the drivers who have really built their companies and pay for their fleet.
So we're kind of wrapping and bumping up against the time before we have to move on to Chris, so that we have some time for questions at the end too. But just kind of as a last question, we're seeing kind of more and more that tech companies are using labor from people who are not like the traditional tech workers that would assume, the software engineers or business jobs in order to make these products work. So I was just wondering, we have an audience that's predominantly tech workers here today. Is there anything that you want to share, directly to them about your work experience that might help them kind of understand better how, your work is interconnected?
Yeah, I mean, I know that many people in the tech industry actually write the algorithms that control drivers. You write the algorithms that are our supervisors. So, and we've had conversations with engineers in the back of the car that say, yeah, I can see what's happening from my company perspective, and I'm really sorry, right? So I know we're connected, we're very connected. I think in getting out of that and sort of stepping back though, I'll just say my day job is in healthcare. Back in the day, we used to take a pencil to paper and write down what our schedule was, and it would be up on the wall in the, in the break room or whatever when you're going to work. Now they do that electronically. Honestly, app deployed work is a wave of the future. And the only thing that differentiates my work in driving from any other industry, whether it be healthcare, even white collar professional tech workers, is that I'm deployed by an app. And so I have no rights and I have no protections, right? So it's really important to realize that this is kind of the wave of the future, and it may be drivers and delivery workers today with Prop 22, but tomorrow it's going to be nurses and construction workers and white collar workers as well. And, this is a very dangerous direction to go. And there's a reason why we have been building labor laws for the last 100 years to basically try to ensure that when people work, they actually can afford homes, healthcare, food on the table for their kids. And that's honestly what's disappearing right now for drivers and delivery workers. And that's why we are really asking people to vote no, to support basic labor rights for even the most precarious workers in California.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nicole, for joining us. And you're sticking around for the end for Q&A, but we want to bring in Chris Benner now that we've kind of had the kind of close-in driver's experience to talk about some of the kind of broader trends in the economy that have brought us, kind of here today, and thinking a little bit about where kind of we might be going in the future. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. And I just have to say, this is my first time meeting Nicole and hearing you talk, Nicole, and you're my new hero. Like, you're just so articulate about all these issues. I could sit and listen to you for the next hour, but really appreciate your perspectives on all these. You made so many really important points.
Thank you.
So Chris, I guess to start off, kind of echoing a point that Nicole made, and that I know some of your research recently has been focused on. We've seen and heard that some of these companies have been slow and limited in providing PPE for their drivers. Can you tell us if this is connected to their status as independent contractors or employees?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely connected. And, one of the things that's really important that Nicole pointed to is, the companies have been contesting their classification under AB5. And it's really clear. And I wanted to emphasize, you mentioned the three criteria that the AB5 sort of codified in law, a Supreme Court decision. Companies have to meet all three of those criteria to then classify someone as independent contractor. It's not just one of the three, it's all three. I want us to be clear about that. And so what they've been trying to do is tweak all sorts of little things around the algorithms that Nicole so clearly articulated are really controlling the work. And until recently, drivers and food deliveries, they didn't even know where the ride they were being offered was going to end up, right? They had to sort of accept a job completely blind in terms of, the job that's actually being created. And they're always trying to tweak these things so that their lawyers can figure out how to argue it in court. And so when COVID comes along, and clearly from a public health perspective and as an employer responsibility perspective, you want to make sure that both your customers and your employees are being safe to not further, spread a deadly disease. You want to make sure the drivers have personal protective equipment and have the hand sanitizer and facilities to clean the car. But if they're going to do that, then it weakens their legal arguments that they're trying to create about not being an employer of record. So they were very slow on doing that. And I'll just say we've been doing research on delivery drivers, particularly in San Francisco, at ride hailing and delivery drivers. And one of the things that I want to make sure is really clear in this workforce too, that the study we did there was designed to be a representative sample of the work being done. Okay. Right? And that's different than all of the people doing the work, because there's a lot of people who do this work part-time, a few hours on the weekend, maybe only do it for a few weeks when they're in between jobs. And that's a very important, part of the workforce. But when you look at the actual sort of services being provided by the companies, it's predominantly people doing it full-time or even more than full-time. I'll say when the study we did in San Francisco, which had a methodology that was able to sample a representative sample of the work being done in the city, 71% of the people surveyed were working more than 30 hours a week. And that included 50% who were working more than 40 hours a week and 30% who were working more than 50 hours a week. Okay. So if you think about this in the context of what is the service that Uber, Lyft, and Doordash provide? The bulk of the services they provide, depending on people who it's their sole source of income and are doing it full-time or more than full-time and earning, as Nicole pointed out, in many cases below minimum wage. And in some of our survey, we tried to actually estimate real costs based on mileage and estimates of costs of maintaining the car. And in some cases we're finding perhaps as much as 20% of drivers, and these are mostly the part-time drivers, are actually losing money. When you fully account in the wear and tear on the car that they're not paying at that moment but are going to have to pay at some point, that they're actually losing money.
So this distinction between kind of the number of drivers versus the amount of work being done, how should we kind of adjust some of our thinking about this debate between flexibility and kind of driver and worker rights and protections in light of that kind of not super intuitive fact?
Well, I think it also comes back to this issue of flexibility. And I think the way to think about it is, the companies themselves are trying to say, look, we offer this opportunity for people to earn a little extra income, when they can, in between whatever other responsibilities that they have. And, you take away that opportunity for people if, AB 5 is properly enforced. And that's a misrepresentation of their business. And they know this very well because they have all the detailed information on how many hours people are working on their apps. They know the bulk of the services they're providing are dependent on this subgroup of all the workers who are providing most of the service, right? And they, in no reasonable court in the land, should be allowed not to treat people as employees because of their control of the workplace, particularly for those, I would emphasize, that are, it's their sole source of income. They don't have a separate business. They're, working extra hours because it's sub-minimum wage in many cases. And so that's one of the ways to think about it is, the services they provide really depend not on this image they're trying to present, of, lots of people doing it part-time. Now, all those people doing it part-time are a really important part of the workforce also. And as Nicole articulated very clearly, most people in this country employed part-time are employees. And as part of that, get all the legal protections that you mentioned and access to unemployment insurance and all that's part of that. So they should also have employee status as well. But there shouldn't be a trade-off between flexibility and being treated fairly. And I'll just say again, in the survey we did in San Francisco, we asked people to rate very clearly how important is flexibility to you, and how important are a set of other things. And in our case, it was a 1 through 5 scale. 66% of people said flexible schedule is a number 5, top priority. And 66% of people said fair pay is 5, a top priority. And then when you look at the other things like predictable pay, access to health insurance and paid time off, and access to the legal protections and benefits, such as you mentioned workers' comp, unemployment insurance, health and safety protections, that's all above 50%.
Gotcha. And so that point about predictable pay and even some things like workers' comp makes me think kind of more about this issue of risk. And if that kind of is more the deeper seated issue here really than flexibility, is it's not a question of, will drivers be flexible or not, but how much risk of operating these businesses belongs to the drivers versus the companies. Do you think that's a reasonable way to think about this issue?
I think that's a very reasonable way to think about it. And it's risk in terms of what happens in a pandemic or, other economic circumstances. And do people have access to, the systems we have put in place to try and help people who are laid off in a downturn? And, aside from the pandemic unemployment assistance and the expansion to include independent contractors, people doing delivery and driving have not had access to unemployment insurance. So they fully bear the risks of that. The costs of maintaining and operating a vehicle, again, that's put on the drivers when they're misclassified as independent contractors. So absolutely. And, again, one of these things too is in the pandemic, jobs dropped, almost completely for the ride hailing. They expanded in food delivery and grocery delivery. So, there's an immense expansion there. And I wanted to point to that because, we often think about Uber and Lyft as sort of the iconic type jobs that are affected here. But think about fulfilling online grocery orders in a grocery store, right? A lot of that work is done by full-time workers of the grocery store companies, but Instacart is also doing that work. And they have had some employee part-time workers fulfilling orders in the store, but they also have, and those are full-time shoppers, but then they also have people who do both the shopping and the delivering who are classified as independent contractors doing precisely the same work in the store as Instacart's employees. But because they're also driving, the company strangely classifies them as independent contractors, completely illegally in California law, I think really clearly. And they're shrinking the size of their employees to increase those that are independent contractors. And I think that'll expand. So that's a clearly place in grocery. And I think if Proposition 22 passes, there's a real chance that that kind of work could expand in lots of retail type jobs, as well as some of the other ones that Nicole mentioned.
Yeah, so if we're thinking that is maybe a possibility if Prop 22 passes, I guess I want to think a little bit kind of about the other direction if Prop 22 doesn't pass, what we think kind of the future of some of these industries look like. The companies, have been claiming that it would force them to shut down, but at the same time, you just mentioned Instacart, which has some people working for it in these roles that are already employees. And I believe there are some other services that aren't quite as household names as, Uber and Lyft, but have an employment-based model instead of an independent contractor model going forward. So are these companies still going to be around, if Prop 22 goes down in November? What do you think is going to happen there?
Absolutely. Absolutely, they will be around. Maybe not all of them, but, the services they provide, and sort of you alluded to this in your sort of framing at the beginning, the ability to, have a driver come by requesting it on a phone, you know, is a tremendous service. And I think that's an innovation that's really valuable. To have that service by paying your drivers sub-minimum wages is not a good business model. And it's only enabled because it's subsidized by venture capitalists who are willing to, you know, forego some of the returns as these companies are trying to get their monopoly control, essentially, of these markets in different places. So we should not be allowing that as a society. It's, you know, we have labor law in place to try and set minimum standards for how we think people should be treated when they're working on the job. And they should not be allowed to sort of build out these markets on the backs of the people doing the incredible services that they're providing. So, you know, what may happen is, yes, the cost may increase. Yes, in some of these places, you know, maybe grocery stores will be hiring drivers rather than contracting with Instacart and Doordash. And we already know Safeway has unionized drivers that are doing grocery delivery. So we know the business model is possible with employees. And yeah, Instacart would have to restructure its pricing system. They would probably have to restructure the algorithms that they use to control the work that people do in ways that are trying to continue to improve their profitability. But you know, they have not been profitable up until just recently, many of these companies. And again, it's because they've been so focused on building out their market share that they'll be willing to take a loss for years, because down the road, then they can charge monopoly prices. So we're going to get higher prices regardless, right? That's just going to happen. That's the way these markets work. Yeah, and we should do that now by paying the people doing the work a fair and legal wage.
So we've been talking a lot about drivers kind of in the app-based economy, but with the last couple of minutes that I have remaining, I wanted to take kind of a step back and just think more broadly about the issue of worker misclassification. You know that, you know, AB5 was intended to target that in a lot of other industries. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the other places in our economy where this misclassification problem comes up and what its impact is on those workers?
Well, one thing that's really important, I think, for all of us to recognize of why misclassification is such a big issue in our country when it's not in many other countries. And it's because we have so many of our sort of benefits and legal protections that are tied to a job. Like, we should not have a health insurance system that's tied to a job. And the pandemic has made that abundantly clear, as, you know, when people get laid off is a time that they, you know, really need health care in a pandemic, and they lose it or having to pay through COBRA. But similarly, if you're hiring someone as an independent contractor, you don't pay into the unemployment insurance system. You don't pay payroll taxes, which is what supports our Social Security and Medicare system. So there's a tremendous incentive for companies to try and get independent contractors when they can, rather than employees. And part of what we need to solve this problem is legislation that creates some kind of universal healthcare system that people take regardless of where they're working. And we need to create systems where companies are paying into unemployment insurance and workers' comp and the Social Security and Medicare system, whether they're hiring people as independent contractors or whether they're hiring people as employees. That would get rid of a lot of the incentive that's in place, which is simply a financial incentive for those workers. The other thing is, like, these things shift over time, and this is coming back to connecting to some of your membership in the TechEquity Collaborative. Is I was doing work on these issues of outsourcing in the 1990s. And at that point, what was happening is a lot of companies were hiring temporary help companies, you know, Adecco, Kelly Services, you know, others people talk about, to do a lot of the work now that is now being done by independent contractors. And so they're always looking for ways to shift risk. You raised that point earlier. We actually did a study in the 90s that was called Shock Absorbers in the Flexible Economy. Wow. Which is precisely about that issue. If you hold on to your core workforce that has, you know, the long-term skills, long-term relationships that are the core of your business, and then hire through whatever mechanisms you can to deal with the flexibility and risk. So we see that in tech industries with tech support and, writing user manuals and, a whole set of other, critical things for the business, but may not be the core engineers or computer programmers that are, developing the new products. So yeah, we'll see it in lots of places.
Policy response to all of this, how would you kind of rate AB5 in terms of like being able to address this problem? It sounds like it might not be like the total end solution here, that we need some kind of other work in. Kind of what's your optimal kind of policy regime that deals with these issues?
Yeah, so I think the way I think about AB5 is, treating an illness versus promoting health, right? AB5 is really trying to treat the illness of what happens when people get classified as independent contractors and try and narrow that misclassification. But it doesn't deal with, I think, what are the underlying incentives and causes of people inappropriately being classified as independent contractors in the first place. And that's where I think we do need the other kind of policies I alluded to. I think the other thing is national labor law legislation, like what does it take to form a union? And we have a labor law system that makes it an incredibly decentralized system in individual workplaces. Most advanced countries in the world have systems that promote representation on an industry-wide basis. So you can have the 19,000 workers in, rideshare workers union or drivers union that, can be bargaining with an association of employers in the industry rather than having to sort of organize by workplace by workplace. So that's another set of, the policies that I think would promote health rather than treat the disease.
Okay, great. Well, we have a few minutes left for questions. So to bring Nicole back and my colleague Megan in, who's been monitoring the Q&A, to ask some of those questions that people have been dropping in there. And please feel free if you have any more to put them in there.
Thanks so much, Annie, and thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, Nicole and Chris. I have been thinking a lot about Prop 22 and reading a lot about it and talking to Annie, and I'm even still learning things on this webinar myself. So I just really appreciate the discussion. I have a question from one of our attendees that kind of feeds into some of these broader scale issues that you were just talking about, Chris. Our audience member asks, assuming Prop 22 is rejected, how can we create a system that is both flexible in scheduling and has compensation models that would preserve driver flexibility? So it really seems like the driving question here is, can we have both? Can we have both flexible work and also have W-2 employees?
I just want to say in New York City, they have adopted a $27 an hour city minimum for drivers. And basically they've seen drivers' real income go up from $11 to $13 an hour to into the $17 or $18 an hour range by instituting that. And drivers still turn on the app when they want to. There's been some pushback from the companies, but the driver organizations are pushing back, and it's, in court. And, but, basically people are still driving and people aren't complaining about it. They're actually making more money than they were on the model previously. So it can work.
Yeah, and I'll just reinforce that to say, part of it is linked to the algorithms and companies' ability to, with large amounts of data, because they have lots of drivers in any sort of market, being able to help predict when people might want, short-term work or part-time work, and, being able to allow people to, have some flexibility in when they're scheduling their work. They might need to put in a system of, okay, maybe you request time a day out rather than in the moment, so they can help sort of adjust that a bit. But, there's very, very smart people that work in these companies who have very good programmers doing the algorithms. And it's certainly possible to run their business in a way that provides some flexibility while also ensuring people are getting a living wage.
And they already incentivize geography and times of day, which is why I work Friday and Saturday nights, right? So because I earn more then. So and that's how they built it in to get their the schedules that they want. So.
Thanks, that's helpful. Another question that we have is hoping for some clarification around what different employment statuses mean. So one of our audience members says, can you clarify which benefits of being an employee would still be available even if Lyft and Uber responded to Prop 22 by rejecting certain drivers or by restricting the maximum number of hours a driver could work per week below 30 hours? Would most of the benefits go away if they refuse to allow people to work full time? So if you can provide some clarity of, at each level of employment from contractor to part-time to full-time, different protections and different benefits are unlocked. So help to clarify for us what would happen if folks were restricted to part-time work only.
What I'll say is that the biggest benefit is knowing that when you put an hour in your base, you're going to have an hourly wage for that at least. You have a base, right? That'll happen whether you work an hour or 70 hours. The other thing is, the big thing is expense reimbursement for the insurance, the phone, the miles that we put in our cars. Again, every mile we drive has to be reimbursed under employment law. Those are the two biggest things. I mean, we're barely even able to think about things like sick leave and health insurance, but those also will be part of it, whether it's disability, workers' comp. We'll start paying into those, and the employer will start paying payroll taxes into those, and then we have those benefits. The other thing is the limiting thing. I mean, we can work 30 hours for Lyft and work 30 hours for Uber if we want to, right? That is not limited by employer law. So, there is no way that this isn't going to be helpful to people. And what I'll say is that the other thing with part-time drivers, I mean, we don't really know what they mean when they say, oh, we'll have to let a lot of people go. I mean, right now, our occupancy rate is, about 60%, meaning 40% of the time our car is empty, and it keeps inching up because they bring on thousands and thousands of new drivers every week, right? And so it actually, they wouldn't have to pull on another new driver, and they would, their numbers would deplete. There's a lot of turnover in the job. So I just really think that, like in any union campaign where the employer issues a lot of threats, this is reminiscent of that. We'll have to leave the state. We'll have to fire people. Those are just standard, canned responses in any struggle where, workers are trying to get their rights. So I do think they're threats, and I think there's really humane ways to figure your way out. If you have too many drivers, stop hiring. That's the way to do it.
Great, thanks for that. I have one more question, and it's actually for our moderator, Ian Eve. One of our attendees is asking, if there's time, can you give a short summary of TechEquity's stance on Prop 22? So you gave us a lot of great information at the beginning summarizing the measure, and now our audience members have some more context from our wonderful panelists. So I guess folks are asking us to give the recap of why TechEquity thinks that folks should vote now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on the clock. I want to say right off top, we have a blog post coming out next week that lays out in lots of detail our feelings on this, so look out for that. But quickly, we're encouraging to vote no on Prop 22, and we think ultimately that the restriction on workers' rights and benefits that we've heard about today are just far too high a cost to pay for any kind of marginal increase in flexibility that you might get from an independent contractor status. There seems like there's plenty of evidence that you can preserve a large amount of that flexibility while still having employees, and that maybe that difference between what Chris was saying about maybe having to request your shift the night before instead of in real time is not enough to kind of justify kind of all the things that the drivers have to give up if they stayed as independent contractors. So that's really our big one. And then, there's also just kind of this larger concern of allowing these companies to spend, in an almost unlimited amount to kind of rewrite the law in their own favor. And that's not really a road that we want to see California going down in this industry and many others too. So that brings us to 1 o'clock and the end of today's program. So I want to encourage all of you to sign up for our other ballot education events where we're going to have more great discussion like this next coming up on the local issues. I want to thank Nicole and Chris once again for joining us today and giving us so much good information. And obviously also encourage everyone to make sure you're registered to vote and your friends are, and make sure that your registration is up to date. So when you get your ballot mailed to you pretty soon, it comes to where you are right now. And last and not least, if you work in tech and you love the work that we're doing for you as TechEquity, we'd love to have you join us as a member. It's $10 a month, and we bring your voice to the table, and all of our advocacy work is done in your name. So if you care about fixing some of these structural issues in public policy, please join us so that we can hold more discussions like today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Great to be here.